Afternoon everyone. I'm here again to continue my report about the different types of criminal punishment, and this is the last criminal punishment. So res- restoration. So a radical different approach to criminal punishment. The goal of restoration is for the offender to make direct amends to both the victim and the community in which crime was committed, although a relatively new practice in modern in the concept of restorative justice can be found in the early system of Western Europe, ancient Hebrew justice, and the pre-colonial Africa societies. So, restorative justice responds to the criminal behavior that focuses on lawbreakers' restoration and the resolution of the issues rising from a crime in which victims, offenders, and the community are both together to restore the harmony between the two parties. So, restorative justice includes direct mediation and conflict resolution between the offender and the victim. There's families and the community. It holds the offender accountable to the other parties, while also providing the offender with learning experience that offer law abiding lifestyle as realistic alternatives to criminality. So, American psychologist Albert Iglash is generally created with the first adopting the term of restorative justice in his article in 1959. Creative restoration its roots in psychiatry, religion, and law, which was the compared and contrast in his 1977 article Beyond Restoration, creative restoration with the retributive justice. So punishment focuses in justice, and rehabilitative justice focus personal reform and perspectives. Then restorative justice views crime as more than simple a violation of the law. So, an offenses against governmental authority. It violates human relationship and injuries to the victim. So, communities and even the offender, each party is hurt in different ways, and each has different needs that must be met in order for healing to begin. To begin. So, crime disturbs societies. So, sense of trust and often results in feelings of suspicion. So, separation and discrimination. So, and crime creates rifts between friends, relatives, neighbors, and even community. It often produces as hostile relationships where no previous relationship produce a hostile relationship where no previous relationship existed, and often overlooked result of crime is that the victim and offender have a relationship. They have painful negative experience in common. So, left unresolved, that hostile relationship negatively affect the welfare of both of them. So, justice requires restoration for justice requires restoration for victims, offender, and the communities are being affected by that crime, by that certain crime. So to promote healing, society must respond to the needs of victimized party as well as the responsibility of the offender. So next slide. And this is a new topic. So Age of Enlightenment. So Age of Enlightenment came from French, literally century of the enlightened. So German of Locke of Clorang, a European intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th century, in which ideas concerning God, about God, so reasoning, nature, and humanity were synthesized into a worldwide that gained wide assent in the West, and that instigated revolutionary development in art of philosophy and politics. So, central to Enlightenment thought were the use and celebration of reason. So, the power by which humans understand the universe and improve their own condition. So, the first focus of the Enlightenment is for reasoning. So, the goals of this is for rational humanity were considered to be knowledge, freedom, and happiness. So, the historian placed the Enlightenment in Europe with a strong emphasis of French. So, the strong emphasis of France. So, during the late 17th and 18th century, or more comprehensively, between the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and the French Revolution of 1789. So, it represents a phase in the intellectual history of Europe, and also programs of reform. So, inspired by a belief that possibility of a better world that outlined specific targets of criticism and programs of action. So, this statement or this idea is, their goal is to improve our society. They want good community for secure for the individual to become happy and contented, and especially it will be secured. So next slide. So the roots of enlightenment can be found in the humanism of the Renaissance, with its emphasizes on the study of classical literature. So the Protestant Reformation, with its antipathy toward received religious dogma, was another prosecutor. Perhaps the most important sources of what's become the Enlightenment were the complementary, rational, and empirical methods of discovering the truth that were introduced by the scientific revolution. So their goal about this is to capture the truth, or to produce, to gain answer of what they want to find. So next slide. So some of the most important writers of the Enlightenment were the philosophies of France, especially Voltaire, and the political philosopher Montesquieu. So other important philosophies were the compilers of the a encyclopedia including Dennis Diderot, Jacques Rousseau, and Condorcet outside the France, the Scottish philosopher and economist David Hume and Adam Smith, the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, Immanuel Kant of Germany, and the American statesman Thomas Jefferson were notably Enlightenment thinkers. So next slide. Next slide. So it was thought during the Enlightenment that human reasoning could discover truths about the world, religion, and politics, and could be used to improve the lives of humankind. So skepticism about received wisdom was another important idea. Everything was to be subjected to testing and rational analysis. Religious tolerance and the idea that individuals should be free from coercion in their personal lives and conscience were also Enlightenment ideas. So it says that truth can give, it means honesty is always give good result, not only in your personality but also in among the circle of individuals, and says that truths are also one way to discover the world, and it means that being true about yourself can also, or being true to yourself can also give you satisfaction, so that you can and satisfaction, and it can help you to visualize things in the future. So next slide. So next is the French Revolution and the American Revolution, were almost direct results of Enlightenment thinking. So the idea that society is a social contract between the government and the governed stemmed from the Enlightenment as well. Widespread education for children and the founding of university and libraries also came about a result. However, there was a counter movement that followed the Enlightenment in the late 18th and mid 19th century from Romanticism. So next slide. So what makes for the unity of such tremendously diverse thinkers under the label of Enlightenment? So for the purposes of this entry, the Enlightenment conceived broadly the Albert Bradley. So the Albert, a leading figure of the French Enlightenment, characterized his 18th century in the midst of it as the century of philosophy par excellence, because of the tremendous intellectual and scientific process of the age. So also because of the expectation of the age that philosophy, that broad sense of the time, which includes the natural with social science, so would dramatically improve human life. So guide because of Alberts, so he guided the characterization of his century. So the Enlightenment is conceive her as having its primary origin in the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century. The rise of a new science progressively undermines not only the ancient geocentric concept of the cosmos, so but also the set of presupposition that had served to constrain and guide philosophical inquiry in the early times. So served to constrain and guide philosophical inquiry in the early times. So the dramatic success of the new science is explaining. I mean the dramat is in explaining. So the natural world promotes philosophy from a handmaiden of theology. So constrained by its purpose and methods to an independent force with a with the power and authority to challenge the old and construct the new. So in the realms both of theory and practice, so on the basis of its own principle, taking as new core of the Enlightenment and aspiration for intellectual progress and the belief in the power of such progress to improve human society and individual lives. So this entry includes description of relevant aspects of the thought of early thinkers such as Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, Bailey, Leibniz, and Spinoza, thinkers whose contribution are indispensable. So to understand the Enlightenment century as the century of philosophy par excellence. So next slide. So age of Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is often associated with its political revolution and ideas, especially the French Revolution in 1789. So the energy created and expressed by the intellectual ferment of Enlightenment thinkers contributes to the grow wave of social unrest in France and the 18th century. So the social unrest comes to a head in the violent political upheaval which sweeps away the traditional and hierarchically structured ancient regime. So the monarchy and the privilege of the notability, so the political power of the Catholic Church, so the French revolutionaries meant to establish in place of the ancient regime. So a new reason-based order instituting the Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality. So through the Enlightenment as a diverse intellectual and social movement, so has no definite end. I mean, the devolution of the French Revolution into the terror in the 1790s. So corresponding as it roughly does with end of the 18th century, so and the rise of opposed movements, so such as Romanticism, so can serve as a convenient marker at the end of the Enlightenment, conceived as an historical period. So next slide. So for Enlightenment thinkers themselves, however, the Enlightenment is not a historical period but a process of social, psychological, or spiritual development unbound to time or place. So Immanuel Kant defines enlightenment in his famous contribution to debate on the question in essay entitled An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? So it happens in 1784. So as humankind's release from itself increased immaturity. So immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. So experiencing convictions shared among Enlightenment thinkers of widely divergent doctrines, Kant identifies enlightenment with the process of undertaking to think for oneself. So, to employ the really know one's own intellectual capacity in in determining what to believe and how to act. So, the Enlightenment philosophers from across the geographical and temporal spectrum tend to have a great deal of confidence in humanity's intellectual powers, both to achieve systematic knowledge of nature to serve as an author, author, authoritative guide in practical life. So, next slide. So, the confidence is generally paired with suspicion or hostility. So, towards other forms or carriers of authority, such as tradition, superstition, prejudice, myth, and miracles. So, insofar as these are sins to compete with an authority of one's own reason and experience. So, Enlightenment philosophy tends to stand in tension with established religion insofar so as the release from self incurred immaturity in this age, religion, I mean daring to think for oneself, awakening one's intellectual powers, so generally requires opposing the rule established. So religion in directing through the thought and action. So the fate of the Enlightenment, if one may call it that, the process of enlightenment of becoming progressively self-directive in thought and action through the awakening of one's intellectual powers leads you ultimately to a better, more fulfilled human existence. So next slide. So from early age, he displayed the essential traits of his character. So Caesar Beccaria. So from an early age, he displayed the essential traits of his characters. A highly volatile temperament resulted in periods of euthanism followed by depression and inactivity. So he was reserved and somewhat taciturn in his social contacts, but placed great value on his personal and family relationships, and at the age of 8, he was sent to the Jesuit school in Parma. Beccaria later described the education he received there as fanatical and stifling to the development of human feelings. So, next slide. So, Beccaria in 1760s proposed marriage to the 16 years old Teresa Blasco. Encountered the obdurate opposition of his father. So, the following year, the marriage took place without parental consent, and the young couple began their life together in poverty. So, the breach between father and son was ultimately repaired, and Beccaria and his wife were received into the family home in 1762. So, a daughter and his first of his 3 children was born. So, next slide. So, the work enjoyed a remarkable success in France, so where it was translated in 1766 and went through seven edition in 6 months. English, German, Polish, Spanish, and Dutch translation followed. The first American edition was published in 1777. Since then, translation in many other language. So, express where Fanmar and Beccaria's interdependence to such writers. So, as the French philosopher Montesquieu, which the generously acknowledged, is clear, and the work nevertheless represent a major advance in criminological thought. So, next slide. So, the objectives of Cesar Beccaria is about the penal system. So, he argued should be devised penalties only severe enough to achieve the proper purpose of security and order. So, anything in excess in tyranny. So, the effectiveness of criminal justice depends largely on the certainty. So, certainty of punishment rather than on its severity. So, penalty should be scaled to the importance of the offenses. So, Beccaria was the first modern writer to advocate the complete abolition of capital punishment, and may therefore be regarded as a founder of the abolition movements that have persisted in most civilized nations since his day. So, next slide. So, England, the utilitarian philosopher and reformer Jeremy Bentham advocate Beccaria's principles, and the Benthamite disciple Samuel Romilly devoted his parliamentary career to reducing the scope of the death penalty. Legislative reforms in Russia, Sweden, and the Habsburg Empire so were influenced by the treaties. So, the legislation of several American states reflected Beccaria's thought. So, next slide. So, in 1768, he accepted the chair in public economy, and commerce at the Palatine School in Milan. Palatine School in Milan, where he lectured for 2 years. His reputation as a pioneer in economic analysis. So, primarily on these lectures published posthumously in 1804, so under the title of Element de Economia Publica. So next slide. So, in his public role, Becarius became concerned with a large variety of measures including monetary reform, labor relations, and public education. A report written by Becarius influenced the subsequent adoption of the metric system in France. So, next slide. So, in 1766, he went to Paris, where he was warmly greeted by this distinguished figure to the day, but cut short the visit because of acute homesickness. His wife died in 1774 after the period of declining health. 3 months later, he married. Property disputes initiated by two brothers and sisters resulted in litigation and that distracted him for many years. Becarius' last months were saddened by events in France. So although he had initially welcomed the French Revolution enthusiastically, he was shocked by the excesses of the Reign of Terror. So, next slide. So, to sum it up, Becarius really contributed a lot of history as well as the criminal justice system that we have nowadays. So, we must be thankful of his achievements in life, and we have to use in a proper way so that we can achieve that we really want it, our field of service. So, next slide. So, after receiving his law degree from the University of Pavia in 1758, he returned to live in Milan. Becarius' 20s were the most important decade in his intellectual and emotional life. He was temperamentally inclined to lethargy and anxiety, but when young, could also be galvanized by inspiring and express his feelings in the language of Russian. He married his first wife in 1761. So, that's all. Thank you for listening. God bless. Goodbye.